What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Thank you for joining me in the third episode in Season 2 of Real Democracy Now, a podcast. Season 2 is looking at representative democracy, and today I am talking with three academics who take different approaches to evaluating representative democracy. These three approaches are by no means the only ones. In fact, there are many indexes and evaluation frameworks in existence. This is why Dan Pemstein, one of the people I speak to today, in conjunction with his colleagues Stephen Meserve and James Melton, have created the Unified Democracy Scores to integrate a number of these measures into one. First up, I speak to Professor Leonardo Morlino, who is a Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Research Centre on Democracies and Democratization at LUISS in Rome. Professor Morlino is a leading specialist in comparative politics with expertise in Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and the phenomenon of democratization. He is the author of several books and more than 200 journal essays and book chapters, published in multiple languages. In 2015-16, he has been conducting research on how the economic crisis affected Southern European democracies and on the economic and fiscal choices of democracies in the same area, within an EU Horizon 2020 grant. Professor Morlino talks to us about the analytical tool he has developed to allow comparison of democracies. Thank you very much for joining me today, Professor Morlino. What would you identify as the key components of a quality democracy?
I developed this idea a few years ago, that is, as a democracy, as a normative concept, and at the same time, when we look at the notions of the quality, we always find three recurrent notions: quality as procedure, quality as content, and quality as a result. Then my key dimension of quality of democracy are first on the procedural aspect, the procedural component, rule of law, electoral accountability, interinstitutional accountability, participation, and competition. Then, in terms of content, the two great ideas of democracy that are freedom and equality, that you can also connect with solidarity. Anyway, the key dimension is equality. And in terms of result, what is a well-known dimension for any political philosopher, normative thinker, that is responsiveness. So these 8 qualities. The reason why, let me say a little bit more about why these 8 qualities and not other qualities. The reason why I was pointing to this 8 quality is in this way, anyone with a different normative notion of democracy can see how much empirically of this notion of democracy has been implemented, carried out, looking at 1, 2, or 3 of this dimension. So my point in terms of quality of democracy is not to give it to you, to the readers, to everyone, my own idea of democracy, but just to develop an analytic tool to see for anyone with different notions of democracy how much of their notion of quality of democracy has been implemented in a given country in a given moment.
So basically you're saying that, yes, it's a tool, you've developed an analytical tool which could apply no matter what model of democracy, whether you were supporting radical democracy or agonistic democracy or whatever. One thing I was wondering, and you sort of did touch on there, was about equality. And I just wondered how important for you is social and economic equality to delivering a quality or a good democracy?
It's a key aspect. It's a very key aspect. Let me say two things that I think is very important. Traditionally, for obvious historical reasons, most of political scientists in the past developed, say following Schumpeter and other people, developed much more what they call the procedural notion of democracy. Actually, they, in the idea of procedural notion of democracy, they added freedom. It is what is one of the ideal of democracy, one of the great values of democracy. That is content, if you remember what I said a moment ago. But then, when we go and ask to the people, what do you think about democracy? And for example, we did that a couple of years ago with the European Social Survey. Always, and in some cases, very dominant, there is the notion of democracy in terms of content. There is the idea that democracy has to deliver. Democracy has to create goods for the people. So you cannot avoid this aspect of equality, of solidarity, of economic condition. Even if you think about the entire literature about the economic voting, you realize how in a key dimension of democracy, such as electoral accountability, we could say, the aspect of content, it is governing people, elected people that provide goods to the citizens is something that most of the citizens expect. One of the results of our research with the ESS was that, for example, the procedural notion of democracy in terms of, above all, of liberal democracy was much more developed in northern part of Europe, where the content, the aspect of content, are taken for granted. So even in Northern Europe, where the people says we praise liberal democracy, we praise the procedural aspect, actually they praise them because they take for granted the content, the equality. And in fact, these countries are countries with, relatively speaking, the highest level of equality if you measure if you measure it in terms of Gini index, for example.
Yes, yes. I'm just wondering the components or the different aspects that you've identified, how do you think they can be applied to different countries? And I'm thinking particularly here comparing established to newly emerging democracies.
Yes. This is a very important question, and I've been working a lot around this question as I applied my analytic tool in some South Asian countries, in some in almost all Latin American countries, in addition to East European and West South European countries. So I realized, no, the point is that in the different countries, in the different areas, one dimension can become much more relevant than another one. Of course, above all, the various aspects, sub-dimension of the rule of law becomes important or very important in some of the emerging countries. You remember when I mentioned rule of law, I mentioned individual security, independence of magistracy, institutional administrative capability, integrity, that is lack of corruption or limited level of corruption, civil control of police and army. These 5 dimensions are the 5 key dimensions of rule of law. And they usually in emerging countries, this aspect becomes more important. Precisely one of the key points, this is for my experience working on transition to democracy, one of the key points during the transition is precisely the establishment of the independence of the judiciary. And when there is the situation of, say, decline, crisis of democracy and going toward more and more hybrid situation that is much more in an authoritarian direction, then one of the first key elements that comes as very important, as crucial for the governing authority that is going in that direction is precisely take control of the judiciary. We have been seeing this in Venezuela in a few years, more recently in Turkey and also in other countries. So to reply in a nutshell to your question, all dimensions are relevant. In emerging countries, some dimensions are more relevant, particularly the rule of law.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I'd be interested in your view on is I get the impression that we expect emerging democracies to sort of take a fairly, it might be a slow, but a fairly smooth transition to democracy, always going forward. And yet I wonder if that's unrealistic when we look back at our own iterative paths, you know, where we've been democratic and then we've maybe gone backwards a bit, and then democracies come again. If you look at France, for instance. What do you think about that? I mean, are we expecting too much of some of these emerging democracies?
Yes, no doubt. Unfortunately, we were a little bit realistic, thinking about a sort of unidirectional trend. I think if I'm right, if my empirical analysis is right, I think that there is a sort of watershed here. And the watershed is between 2003, 2004, 2005. It is about 12, 13 years ago. This is the moment when, in terms of a trend toward having more and more democracy, there is a stop. I think this is very much related to the change of U.S. foreign policy after the 9/11, after the Twin Towers killings and terrorist attack, after the enlargement, the big wave of enlargement of Eastern Europe, and when particularly, and this is the third aspect, an alternative became much more established. I mean, Russia. Putin's Russia became a sort of a pole of attraction also for other countries around Russia, and above all, Putin started developing his nationalist policy in terms of creating a larger area of influence for Russia, also in terms of market. This is a complex story, and I stop at this point.
Thank you for that. And look, finally on this question, I was just wondering, you know, there's a sort of a new concept being written about called non-Western democracy. What's your perspective on that?
Yes, no, this is something that we discuss a lot. On this, my view is actually a view that is the result of two contributions given in the 90s. The first one, and I think is very important, is by Amartya Sen. You remember when Amartya Sen tried to emphasize democracy as a universal value, he stresses the aspect of democracy in terms of avoiding famine, avoiding extreme economic crisis. And again, you understand, by the way, how for Amartya Sen and for the people in all these countries Amartya Sen refers to, from India to the other people, a democracy that has to deliver, that is, you have to look at the component, the content of democracy is very important. Anyway, if democracy has the only regime that avoid this extreme of economic crisis. The other aspect to be complemented is what Giovanni Sartori said in an article on the Journal of Democracy in mid-90s of last century, in terms of democracy as demoprotection. That is, democracy is the regime that is able or try to avoid the sufferances, violence, suppression for its own citizens. So in this way, if you consider Sen and Sartori, you put together, in a sense, the input and output of democracy, Sartori input, Amartya Sen output, in understanding how democracy can travel. No doubt, democracy was a Western invention, but democracy revised through aspects related to the rule of law, electoral accountability, all the dimensions that we said, or some of the dimensions that we said, can travel. And the reality suggests so. So, in a sense, there is not much of discussion.
Yes, thank you for that. When I think about some of the standard elements of representative democracy, I sort of often think about the potential for unintended consequences. And I think one is the one you've mentioned about accountability. And key element of that is the ability of citizens to replace politicians who they're dissatisfied with at the next election. But in practice, this can lead to short-term thinking and populist approaches as politicians focus more on winning the next election than on necessarily doing what might be considered the right thing. And I know some writers specifically relate the democratic deficit to the design of the current system of representative democracy. What's your thinking on that, and how does your analytical tool address those issues?
My analytical tool is limited on these issues, as is limited the invention of democracy. As I said, democracy is a collective invention of the mankind that no one was looking at. We could say that democracy as such is a sort of a side consequence, more than really an invention that everyone would like to have. If we consider, for example, the great movements, the great actors, say, of 19th centuries, the socialist politicians, the socialist leaders, the socialist ideology was looking for other aspects. The communist ideology was looking for other kind of regime. The liberal democracy, the liberal ideology was looking for other kind of regime. So what we now call democracy, and actually is a mass liberal democracy, in a more explicit way, is a result, an invention that no one was looking for. It's a sort of intermediate result out of different goals. This result has many limitations, many problems. No doubt, the short term, that you have mentioned, the possibility of success of populism that you have mentioned, are all of them. But we were not able to do better. Again, it's simple as that. We were not able, as mankind, to do better. Maybe with technology we can improve some aspect of democracy, but we will see, because we are realizing that technology, information, computer, digital development created a set of opportunities. But within this set of opportunities, this range of opportunities, there was also the range for some negative aspect, such as an authoritarian development within the new protest party that developed in Southern Europe, for example, from the Podemos in Spain to Five-Star movements in Italy to Syriza in Greece, where there was room, again, of course, for protest, and this is a positive aspect of democracy, for the expression of discontent, of dissatisfaction, but also room for authoritarian position with strong authoritarian leaders that were conditioning the vote of a lot of people. So again, this is a sort of a path that we are doing, and we think, we hope that we will learn from our mistakes, as usual.
Is your view that it's not possible to move democracy beyond the nation state to a more global level?
This is a specific issue that we have been addressing in these years for European Union. It is European Union as a supranational identity. Can we move democracy beyond, say, the nation state, Italy, France, Poland? The Brexit said no. That is the reaction of the citizens and the reaction of leaders is in the trend, in the direction of re-anchoring democracy to the nations.
Yes.
Of course, we can think about a new, say, federal situation, a development in terms of federalism. This is what is the most known path that we have in our, say, repertoire, in our possible political repertoire. But even this limited, more moderate path, that is go in a federal direction, as we have been seeing when looking at the European Union, is very difficult to be carried out. It's very difficult to be realized. So again, it's probably in the future we can see this kind of development, but it's not easy. It's not easy. It's not easy above all when there is a resistance of the leader of each country to give in their power, give in their possibility of decision making.
Yes.
This is the kind of sort of a struggle. Of course, within, and this is probably the key point to stress now, within a situation of economic growth, could be easier to go in the direction of federalization, say, of the European Union. Within a situation of economic crisis, and in these 10 years, we were within economic crisis to greater extent or to lesser extent, is much more difficult. The sort of re-anchoring and the sort of a re-territorialization of democracy that I was mentioning is is one of the consequences of the economic crisis of these years.
Next, I talk with Professor Wolfgang Merkel, who is the Director of the Research Unit, Democracy and Democratization at the WZB Social Science Research Centre in Berlin, as well as heading up the Centre for Global Constitutionalism and a number of other projects. He has written widely on democracy, democratization, social democracy, and democracy and capitalism, to name but a few, in academic and non-academic publications. Professor Merkel is a co-project leader of the Democracy Barometer. This project developed an instrument to assess the quality of democracy in 30 established democracies and is the focus of my discussion with Professor Merkel today. So, Wolfgang, what would you identify as the key components of a quality representative democracy?
Of course, you have to name immediately free, general, and fair elections. But this is certainly not enough. In order to make democratic elections democratically meaningful, they have to embed it in different, what I call, partial regime. Specific rights and obligation of a democratic system. These are political rights, they must be guaranteed. These are civil rights, which each individual has, and even the state cannot take it away. And these civil rights are quite important in order to use your political rights. And then there must be a kind of checks and balances. This is what we are missing today in the United States. And those who are elected, those are the ones who are authorized to do decisions which are binding for the whole society. So you have free and general and fair election. You must have a crucial role of the parliament. This is the representative institution of a representative democracy, and you must have a responsible, but especially also a responsive government. Last but not least, you need organizations which are acting within these institutions. And normally these organizations are in particular political parties. This is more or less a crucial set of institutions and actors which are playing within these institutions according to the a priori fixed constitutional rule. This is what I would like to define what a representative democracy is all about.
And there are many different approaches to measuring the quality of democracy. How did the Democracy Barometer come about, and how is it different from other measures?
Yeah, this is something one has certainly to justify. There are many measurements of the quality of democracy around, and they are easily accessible through the internet. Me and my team here at the Berlin Social Science Center got into contact with the University of Zurich, and we were talking about the deficits we see in the current measurements of democracy, such as Freedom House or Polity4. These are the most accessed indices of the quality of democracy. They have, among others, an important disadvantage. They do not measure the differences between the well-established democracy. I would immediately add the so-called OECD countries, the highly industrialized countries. But we observe, and this is what each kind of somehow professional observer would immediately say, there must be a difference, and there is a difference between, let's say, the American States of America at the time of President Donald Trump, or of Italy when Silvio Berlusconi was governing the country on the one side, and let's say Sweden and Denmark, which are always the countries which perform best in almost all of these democratic measurements, they are different. There is a difference between Sweden and Trump's America, and there is a difference between the Finnish democracy or Danish democracy and Silvio Berlusconi. But Freedom House and the other measurements did not get these differences. All these established democracies got more or less the highest score. Therefore, we thought we have to develop an instrument which is sensitive to these differences, and this was, so to say, the hour of the birth of our democracy barometer. And second reason was not that we thought it has to be a European barometer which measures the quality of democracy, but we discovered a certain bias among those measurement enterprises which you find in the United States especially. They have, as Freedom House, for example, they have a clear US bias in conceiving and conceptualizing democracy. We wanted to have a distance to these kind of biased model of democracy and tried to develop a model which is applicable to all the developed democracy without having either an European or a Swiss or an US-American bias. So this was the second reason. And the third reason why we thought this is useful, most of the other indices are not very transparent. What we are doing, we are measuring the quality of democracy by 100 indicators, which we derived from a concept of democracy which is based on 3 core principles. And these principles are freedom, political equality, and control of those who govern. And then we derived step by step the basic functions, the basic components, subcomponents, and then at the end, 100 indicators. And what we are doing with these democracy barometer, we put everything on the internet. Each of these 100 indicators for now 70 countries, and each person can access each single indicators. At the end, people can say, okay, these people from Berlin and Zurich, they have a much too much ambitious concept of democracy, and I will compose my own concept of democracy, and she or he can do it because they have access to all these figures we collected for the principles and the indicators. So it is not something we prescribe to the scientific community, but we deliver an idea and we deliver indicators and data, and our colleagues or each person, even regular, normal, non-political scientist person, can construct her or his own concept of democracy. And I think these three advantages justify that we came up with a new measurement of the quality of democracy.
And you actually mentioned then that people might feel that the democracy barometer is an ambitious process. In the actual website, you talk about it being that the conception of democracy used is a middle range concept. I'm quite familiar with the narrow view of democracy around mainly voting, and you're positioning the democracy barometer in the middle range. And I wondered what would sit on the other side then, because your barometer seems to me to be so comprehensive and to cover so many indicators. What would be something that was more fulsome, I guess, than the version of democracy used in the barometer?
You're completely right. If we are talking about a minimalist concept of democracy, which means it's all about democratic elections, and a more mid-range concept, which takes into account these 5 partial regimes I was talking about at the beginning, meaning institutions, organizations, and so forth. We can also talk about a maximalist concept, and such a maximalist concept would include the result, meaning the policies which were coming out of the political process as decisions. And after a long discussion, we decided not to take these results of the political process, outcomes or first outputs and then outcomes, into consideration, because we first thought there will not be a common census what a good outcome is in terms of distributing income, distributing wealth, and even not whether a country should have a compulsory or non-compulsory health insurance. So we took a certain distance to these outcomes, and had second also the discussion, can we determine to a large extent what social justice means? And this is something what maximalists take into account. They are arguing it is democracy of, by, and for the people, meaning there must be something for the people. I agree completely, but I disagree that we can have a common opinion what this should be, and it is exemplified when we look at these eternal discussion what social just outcomes in fact mean. So this is a reason why we did not include such a maximalist concept. We did not include the outcomes. Nevertheless, I am completely convinced the outcomes of a political regime have to be considered by the citizens as fair. If the citizens do not conceive or perceive the outcomes of the political procedures as fair, they cannot consider their political democratic regime as legitimate. So therefore, one should take this into consideration, but one can separate it from an analysis of the quality of democracy, and this is what we did. The very last point to this question is, if we would have integrated, for example, these question of social justice, fair outcomes, and so forth, then the whole concept would never have made it across the Atlantic. The US-American comparativists and scholars on democracy, they are basically minimalist, and they would say this is something of the European thinking that democracy works only if it is a social democracy.
Yes, thanks for that. And you mentioned a couple of indices there. Where do you see the Varieties of Democracy project fitting within this sort of field of evaluating democracy?
There is a different method. The different method is very much that the Varieties of Democracy project relies especially, not exclusively, but especially on the judgment of experts. They have a huge financial resources behind them, and they can do it, and they are going back until the year 1900. This is certainly something we cannot do, we could not do, and we focus more, we do not focus on expert judgments. We focus more on indicators we think which are valid and reliable for what we try to measure. But I have to say with a certain envy, what they are doing now in the Scandinavian countries with these Varieties of Democracy project is certainly something which is amazing, but still thinking in focusing on these objective indicators, making clear why we have selected these indicators by a kind of conceptual tree from principles to indicators. We still have a market niche in democracy research.
Just moving to a slightly different topic, there's a growing body of work around the idea of non-Western democracy. What do you think about this concept?
Not very much, if you ask me so directly. I don't think it is a very good description, Western democracy. I come back to this point. I also don't think we have a Western, Eastern, Southern democracy or Asian democracy. There was a debate 2 decades ago, and sometimes you hear about African or even Muslim democracy. On the other side, sometimes you hear guided democracy, controlled democracy, illiberal democracy. Always, if you have these kind of adjectives added to a democracy, one has to be careful. And most of them mean less democracy. Most of them are apologetic, meaning they want to apologize for some things which are missing in their concept of democracy. What is very interesting, at least in Europe, and you find it in the US, and I was living for several months, 2 times in Australia, and I found it in the official politics and policies as well. There is this kind of illiberal trait. There is a way to understand democracy as something which has to launch majoritarian decision, and all these minority rights are more luxurious things than the core of it. And in Europe, you have in Eastern Europe, in 2 countries where these right-wing populists are governing. This is Hungary and Poland. And what is interesting beyond Hungary, for example, that Viktor Orban, the prime minister, is not only governing semi-democratically, he makes out of this defect a virtue. He is arguing we have an illiberal democracy, and this illiberal democracy is more vital, is more powerful, and will survive. And on the other side, you have this weak, multicultural, liberal democracy. So they are claiming the future is this kind of democracy. And if you are probably already beyond the democratic border, if you look to people like Erdogan in Turkey, or even worse, Putin in Russia, these are not outright authoritarian regimes, but they are governing in an authoritarian manner, and they get huge support by the citizens. This is something which we should be worried about. So you have a kind of trend away from sophisticated liberal democracy to a more majoritarian and sometimes demagogic style of governing. So at the end, Asian democracy, Muslim democracy, guided democracy, these are what I call defective democracy, if they are democracies at all.
Finally, I spoke with Daniel Pemstein. Dan is an assistant professor of political science at the North Dakota State University. He is a methodologist who specializes in measurement and builds statistical tools to answer substantive questions in comparative legislative studies and political economy. He is involved in a number of statistical projects, including two I'll be talking to him about today, the Varieties of Democracy project and the Unified Democracy Scores. So Dan, can you tell us a little bit about how the Varieties of Democracy project came about and what it involves?
Yeah, sure. I joined the project a little later than some other people, so some of this is secondhand, but I can give you the basic idea. I think a lot of the people in the project, or at least sort of the key members of the project, have been thinking about this for 20 years. But if you had to anchor it to a particular time, it would be around mid 2000s, 2006 or 2007. The U.S. National Research Council put a report out that basically highlighted the inability of the academic community and the sort of the foreign aid community to measure the effectiveness of aid interventions, given the measures that were out there of sort of democratic institutions at the time. And so I think that was sort of what got the ball rolling. And then sort of two academics, John Gehring, who was at Boston University at the time and now is at the University of Texas at Austin, and Michael Coppage, who's at Notre Dame, started organizing a series of conferences, and it slowly grew, and different people, so Staffan Lindberg at Gothenburg University and Jan Theorell, who's at the University of Lund, both of those are in Sweden, kind of joined on, and those were the original sort of principal investigators of the project, and over time it kind of snowballed from there. So that's kind of how it started. I think the motivation was, we needed better measures in the sense that we didn't have very fine-grained measures of democratic institutions. And also, I think there was a reaction to the fact that a lot of the existing measures out there, so I don't know how much background detail I should give, but the big measures out there for measuring democracy in the academic community and to some extent the policy community are this Polity project out of the University of Maryland and Freedom House, which is sort of a nonprofit organization. And there's sort of a perception that they're very US centric. So a lot of the funding from Polity came from the CIA. Freedom House is largely funded by the US State Department. And so I think that the sort of two motivations here was we needed fine-grained measures, and we needed measures that were not necessarily driven by a US centric view of the world.
And what are the key indicators that the Varieties of Democracy project uses to assess the quality of democracy? You talked about institutions.
Well, stepping back a little bit, I'll kind of tell you about sort of what VDEM looks like, because that'll give you an idea. That this question is actually sort of hard to answer in a sense, because VDEM does a ton, right? So it's this project that measures hundreds of regime traits. So things as simple as, do you have a bicameral legislature? Which actually is not as simple as it sounds. That can sometimes be hard to measure, but that's a simple example. And it could be something as complex as like, to what extent does the government achieve control over the entry and exit of civil society organizations, right? Which is a pretty subtle question. And so anyway, the project tries to measure many of these things, and we rely on local experts and academics around the world to do it. So there's thousands of people involved in this sort of expert survey and rating process. And it looks at a lot of different dimensions of democracy. So sort of traditional stuff about electoral institutions, but also looks at, rates you on kind of levels of how liberal a democracy you are, how deliberative, participatory, or egalitarian, which are sort of like secondary dimensions or other dimensions of what democracies look like. And so I guess, like, if I was going to say what are the key measures, it's really kind of hard to answer that question, right? Because, VDEM has this electoral democracy index, which is a composite of a bunch of other indices, freedom of association, clean elections, freedom of expression, and so on. And then if we took one of those indices, we could break it down into a bunch of other sub-indicators, like how autonomous is your electoral management board? Do you have a full-fledged voter registry? Is there a lot of vote buying in your elections, right? And so I think one of the big advantages of the project is it measures a ton of different things. And I think what the important indicators are kind of depend on the question that people ask with the data that we're providing.
My understanding is that the focus is, as you said, it's on quantitative measures so that you can do comparisons around the world. Can you tell me a bit about how those measures were developed and how it actually works? You've mentioned sort of local experts. I mean, I know the Varieties of Democracy is a huge project. Whenever I go to the website, I'm just sort of blown away by how many different things there seem to be happening. But I guess, for someone outside of the project who hasn't yet been to look at the website, how does it work? Because it just seems so huge.
Yeah, so I mean, the organizational structure is basically that there are about 15 academics based largely in Europe and the US who kind of help design the surveys that we use and also sort of manage the project overall, right? And so these are experts drawn from different backgrounds. So some people are experts in Africa or Asia. We have people with expertise all around the world, but also different expertise in sort of thematic areas in politics. So people who are experts in legislative studies or electoral studies, and so on. And so basically, these people designed the initial survey questions. These were circulated within the team and revised. There was a pilot study back in 2010, and based on the sort of results of that pilot study, the questions were revised more. And so that's kind of how the questions themselves were created and how we made choices about what we wanted to measure and what we didn't want to measure, right? And then beyond that, basically, we have sort of a distributed structure where we recruit experts to rate particular countries. And we try to get like at least 5 experts per, observation in the data set. So country in a particular year for a particular question that we're asking. And a lot of those, so generally about 3 out of those experts will be people who are either local to the country or at least were sort of locally trained or grew up in that country. And then we also have external people who rate the countries as well, but are experts in that area. And then beyond that, when we can get them, we ask people to rate multiple countries on the same dimension. And I'll talk a bit about why that's important. I can talk about why that's important sort of in a minute.
Okay, thanks for that. So, your role is very much on the statistical side of things. Can you tell me what you see as the key challenges to collecting and analysing the data from around the world, actually making sense of it and making something meaningful out of it?
Yeah, so I'm the project manager for measurement or whatever and so I didn't write the questions, but my job is to sort of take a bunch of information that we get from these individual experts and make sense of it. And this is, as you might imagine, kind of tricky because we're measuring these like regime characteristics, and a lot of these things are not things that you can directly observe, right? So that example I gave before about civil society entry and exit, that's a largely a question of judgment, right? And it's a sort of subjective question. And so naturally, when we ask 5 people to rate a particular country in a particular year on that question, they give us different answers. And so my job is to sort of arbitrate between those answers and then also to make sure that like the answers we're getting for India make sense in the context of the US or Australia, right? And so what we've done is we've adapted tools from educational testing, right? So tools that were used to help design standardized tests. And so the analogy I normally use is that rating countries in a particular year is sort of like asking a bunch of people to grade an essay and then assigning a grade to that essay based on the various grades you get from the graders that you used, right? And so if I have 5 graders and I ask them to grade the same essay, they might all say that it's an A or a B, but they might have different levels of strictness, right? So some might be harsher graders than others. And they also might, some might be better graders, essentially like they make fewer errors, right? Or random errors than others. And so we basically adapted these tools, but in our world, instead of grading essays, you're grading country years, right, on a particular question. And we have these experts who give us those ratings. And so there are statistical tools out there that allow us to kind of adjust for differences in strictness across raters, and also to take into account the fact that some raters are better or like they're more or less error prone, right, than other raters. And so we can kind of estimate that and we can adjust for that. And what that allows us to do is take this sort of mishmash of data we get and pump out like a single answer, not a perfect answer, right? But sort of a compromise between what our various raters are giving us. And also, I think kind of importantly, although it's hard to communicate effectively, we can also give people estimates of how confident we are about our ratings in a particular context, right? So if there's a lot of disagreement between raters, we can say, well, okay, here's the rating we think we should give, but we're also not very confident about this rating, and actually it should be somewhere in this rather large range, right? And in other cases, when the raters agree a lot, we can say, oh, okay, here's our estimate, and we're pretty confident about that, right? And so I think that's been one of the biggest challenges in the project in terms of aggregating all this information. The other aspect of it is something I alluded to a little bit earlier, which is in order to do that well, we need to have experts who are capable of rating multiple countries so that we can kind of anchor people's scales to each other across space and across context, right? So my perception of corruption in a particular election as an American might be very different than the perception of a Mexican based on their sort of, personal lived experience, right? And so in order to adjust our relative strictness, essentially, based on that, we need to have some crossover in ratings. And so that's something we've done as well, is gather what we call bridging data in order to allow our models, like our statistical tools, to adjust for this sort of context problem.
That sounds really amazing. So can you give me a bit of an example? You talked about addressing or factoring into your analysis the strictness of a particular rater. How do you actually do that? Is that based on your history with that person, or, I don't know, an intake interview? Or how do you actually work out what their strictness is or their accuracy?
So it's based actually on the pattern of ratings that they give us. It's easiest to think about within the context of a single country, although it generalizes. So basically, for a single country, for a particular question, you will give us ratings over a 100-year period, or a little more than a 100-year period. And so we have a bunch of observations for each rater. So we have 5 or 6 raters, or sometimes 20. It really depends on the question, giving us ratings. And say I have a rater named Bob, and Bob always gives me, on a scale of 1 to 5, a 5, right? And I have a rater named Mary, and Mary always gives me, on a scale of 1 to 5, a 3. But neither of them varies. And then I have other raters who do different things. I can learn from that pattern of rating whether or not Bob and Mary may be giving me the same answer, right? Their version of what a 5 or a 3 is different. And if I have enough raters doing that, I can kind of estimate what the sort of true value is. And it's based on this underlying assumption that there's some true value, and they have sort of thresholds that they're placing on this underlying scale. And we're estimating where those thresholds are on the scale. And so it's all based on the pattern of information that raters are giving us. And that's why we need to gather what we're calling bridging information. So if that works well within a country, I get tons of observations. But if I want to compare 2 countries, I need some overlap between those 2 countries in the ratings I'm getting in order to estimate where the typical rater in one country is in level of strictness versus in another country.
And would you usually do that by having overlap of raters, like having people rate 2 countries or two factors in 2 countries or more? Is that how that works?
Yeah. So when the project started, we just had people rate their own countries, and that was before I was part of the project. And then I came in and argued that we needed to, in order to sort of deal with this problem, we needed to start getting these what we call bridge raters. And so what we'd do is if someone was an expert in a region, we'd ask them if perhaps they could rate multiple countries in the region over the whole time period. Lots of people were, are experts in a place, but were trained. They got their PhD typically somewhere else. And so there are a series of often sort of Western countries where a lot of our raters know something about those countries and can give us ratings at least in recent years. And so we've slowly started to gather up a ton of information or a ton of crossover information between raters. I mean, it's an ongoing part of the project. It's something that is constantly evolving. And at some point, we're going to tap out our ability to do this because there's only so much expertise people have, right? Not everyone can rate that many countries, and actually most people can only rate one or two, right?
Yeah.
But that's the way that this process works. The other thing we're doing is we're starting to use a tool called an anchoring vignette, which is sort of popular in the survey literature. And the way anchoring vignettes work is instead of asking people to rate countries, you describe a fake, like an imaginary country to them. And you ask them to rate that imaginary country. And therefore, you can get everyone to rate these imaginary countries because they don't need any real expertise to rate the particular situation. And therefore, you can use these anchoring vignettes, is what they're called, as a tool for learning how strict people are.
Oh, that's a very good idea. People would still bring their own personal spin to it, but it would give you a much stronger comparison, wouldn't it, than perhaps some other ways. So you're a co-developer of the Unified Democracy Scores. Can you tell me a bit about what the UDS does and whether it relates to the VDEM measures at all?
Yeah, so the UDS is basically the same sort of statistical approach, but applied to a different set of data, right? So before VDEM was around, there were a lot of measures out there for measuring democracy. And so they're the big ones I talked about before, Polity and Freedom House. But they're, especially in the academic community, there's been, I don't know, like 10 or 15 different measures of democracy in a broad sense, right? So not estimating or not trying to measure very specific aspects of democracy, but kind of on a scale of 1 to 10, how democratic is this country, right?
Yeah.
And something that was sort of challenging, I think, both for practitioners and academics, is we have all these scales and they kind of agree with each other most of the time, but which one is better? And how do we choose which one to use? And the idea of the UDS was to apply the same basic idea, right? These are just different raters of this big idea, how democratic is a country, and they're giving different ratings. And so they're essentially people grading an essay. And so let's apply the statistical tool and come up with a compromise rating that compromises across all of these different democracy scores that are out there. Gives us some sense of how much disagreement there is. So again, giving an estimate of certainty to go along with ratings. And this came out of sort of a push in political science in general to think a lot more about how certain we are about the data that we use, because a lot of the time our data are pretty subjective, right? We treat them as if they're sort of like, we have quantitative data, we treat it as if it's ground truth. And we wanted to highlight the fact that if you're measuring democracy, which is a pretty squishy concept, there is no ground truth, right? And we can actually quantify how little truth, not little truth, but how little certainty there is a lot of the time when we have multiple people trying to measure the same thing. And so that's kind of how it ties in. And it's why I'm working on VDEM now, is that, sort of my work there had a direct application to this new measure when it was conceived later on.
And has the UDS been used by yourself or other people since you developed it? Because I as I said, I did come across this in my early reading when I started my PhD, and I was just amazed at how many different approaches there were to measuring democracy at a quantitative level. And I really think the UDS is such a good idea to try and bring that together. Are people using it, or as you say, has it moved the VDEMs more or less the place where it's being done?
Yeah, people have used it quite a bit. So I think these days, at least within political science, and you see it a little bit outside the field, it's mostly in the academic literature. I don't see it much in the policy side of things. But people almost, if they want to, study democracy in this big sense, right, do some sort of quantitative analysis of, democracy writ large, where they use a variable that measures democracy. It's relatively hard at this point, I think, to publish a paper that doesn't at least check that the UDS is giving you the same answers as these other scores. So I think it's had a decent impact in that sense, but I think it's less used in the policy community because it's less simple, right? And it's harder to wrap your mind around than some of the scores that are kind of built into it.
Thanks for joining me today. We'll be hearing from Professors Morlino and Merkel again later in Season 2, when we look at the challenges facing democracy and the relationship between democracy and capitalism. Next week's episode covers a topic mentioned today, non-Western democracy. I'll be speaking with Associate Professor Benjamin Isakan about democracy in the Middle East and a PhD student from Ethiopia, Zelalem Silne, about Ethiopian democracy. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.